Tai prašom, pradėkite. So welcome, Mr. Robert Vitas, and thank you for agreeing to deliver the interesting presentation about civil-military relations under President Antanas Smetona. I believe your insights and research will be very interesting material, not only for Lithuanian audience, but also for other people who lives outside of Lithuania, of course. So, Mr. Robert, floor is yours.
Thank you, Vitas. Thank you very much. Good day, everybody. It's wonderful to be here. I'm going to share my screen with you, and I hope you can see it. I'll put it on slideshow. So my topic today is civil-military relations under President Antanas Smetona from 1926 until 1940. My name is Robertas Vitas. I'm the chairman of the board of the Lithuanian Research Center in the United States. We have 3 facilities in the Chicago area, 1 in the city of Chicago, and 2 in Lemont, Illinois. We are the largest Lithuanian academic institution outside of Lithuania. We're a library, an archive, a book publisher, and we constantly have visitors from Lithuania and other countries coming to our facilities to do research for their theses, their dissertations, books, articles, etc. So it's wonderful to be here with you today, and we'll just jump right into the topic. We'll begin with a little bit of history and philosophy on civil-military relations. And while the field of civil-military relations was really developed in detail in the 20th century, we can go back to the origins of Western civilization, to ancient Greece, and to the Greek philosopher Plato. And in Plato's Republic, he notes the utility of military education in serving and guarding the state. In a conversation with his friend Glaucon, Socrates states, "The one who on each occasion is tested and comes through untainted must be appointed ruler of the city and guardian, and he must be given honors, and must be allotted the greatest prizes in burial and the other memorials. And the man who is not of this sort must be rejected." So already the ancient Greeks were saying that competence in military leadership had to be connected to leadership of the state. And those were the only people worthy of leadership of the state, those who were able to stand in defense of it. Later on, Edward Gibbon, the historian, in discussing the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, presented a passage that had, for me, kind of an eerie connection to what happened after the coup of December 1926. And please forgive the long quote, but I wanted to share this with you. This is in Rome, of course. "The Senate was commanded to assemble. After Julian had filled the Senate House with armed soldiers, he expatiated on the freedom of his election, his own eminent virtues, and his full assurance of the affections of the Senate. Yet, after the crowd of flatterers dispersed and left him to darkness, solitude, and terrible reflection, he passed a sleepless night, revolving most probably in his mind his own rash folly, the fate of his virtuous predecessor, and the doubtful and dangerous tenure of an empire which had not been acquired by merit. He had reason to tremble. On the throne of the world he found himself without a friend, and even without an adherent." I wouldn't necessarily completely apply this analogy to Smetona's situation. He certainly had friends and he had adherents, but he had also made enemies prior to the coup and certainly after the coup, and then indeed during the 10 years following the coup, with his own behavior and with the behavior of some military officers, as we will be seeing. A brief discussion of what I call the military mind and the mindset of conservative realism, that in general, military officers have a contempt for politics and disorder. They want an orderly society, a society that they feel is being properly run by the state, and hence a state that is worthy of its respect and being defended. Thomas Hobbes, the British writer, in his book Leviathan, discussed the inherent disorder of the human condition and human society, and how there needed to be what he referred to as a Leviathan, a powerful leader to be able to essentially dictate, to be able to create order out of disorder, and sometimes to do so through harsh means. Now, Hobbes was living through a very disruptive time in English history, with constant political strife and warfare, and even attempted assassinations of kings. So he was living in the midst of that turbulence, and he felt that the Leviathan, a powerful civil and military figure, was the only way to bring order to his world. More in our era, in the 20th century, the previous century, the sociologist C. Wright Mills wrote a book called The Power Elite, and he discussed various kinds of elites, political elites, corporate elites, but he also discussed military elites and the officers' corps, and how officers inherently like to have good order and discipline, and they don't like to see the lack of order and discipline in political activity and in civil society. Sam Sarkeesian was a professor at Loyola University in Chicago, and I bring him up because indeed he was my professor and my dissertation director. And he at length would discuss military professionalism and civil military relations. A little bit of his background, you see two photographs, one when he was already an older gentleman, and he passed away 13 years ago. But over on the right, you see him in his gear with his parachute. Sam was the son of Armenian immigrants to the United States and one of the original Green Berets after World War II. The Green Berets were actually formed after World War II in Europe, using soldiers who spoke the various languages of Eastern Europe to be able to infiltrate behind what was becoming the Iron Curtain into Soviet-occupied territory to gather intelligence, to be able to assist any local opposition, and then to be able to return to friendly lines. And so Dr. Sarkeesian served in the U.S. Army both as an enlisted man and as an officer for 22 years. So he presents 6 aspects of the military profession. One is bureaucratic expertise. The military officers are the experts in everything that is military, and those who are outside, unless they are retired military officers, do not possess that expertise. And so, in the military mind, there is, even though they are serving society, there is somewhat of a wall built up between the officer corps and the rest of society. Secondly, as we know, the aspect of hierarchy, a chain of command, and also unity of command. Also within that hierarchy, professional norms are applied for promotion, for decorations, for discipline, for assignments to particular military units, and for particular tasks. Military officers do not like outsiders, especially political leaders, coming in and telling them how to run their business. Thirdly, the military becomes a total social system. At least on a U.S. Army post, from my experience, everything that a soldier, an officer needs, and his family, it's there on the post. You can get your hair cut, you can go grocery shopping. There are movie theaters and bowling alleys, recreational facilities, and then schools for children, Department of Defense schools, and then certainly that's where the soldier, the enlisted person, or the officer goes to work. So you become immersed in this separate society known as the armed forces. Fourthly, Your sole client is the state. An attorney, a physician, other professionals may have multiple clients, but for the military officer, the state is the one and only client. And this client also calls on ultimate liability, meaning unlike other professions, with the exception of, let's say, police officers, a soldier is called to ultimate liability. Namely, part of the job could be being injured, certainly, or also giving his life for the sole client. And then finally, an officer is called to absolute institutional and professional loyalty, to respect his own profession and to respect other professionals. The 20th century also saw the development of two different theories of civil-military relations as presented by two scholars. One was Morris Janowitz, who was a sociologist at the University of Chicago, and the other was Samuel Huntington, who was a political scientist at Harvard University. Morris Janowitz wrote a book called The Professional Soldier, and Sam Huntington wrote a book called The Soldier and the State, both classics in the literature of civil-military study and relations. They did look upon civil-military relations slightly differently. Janowitz saw an officer not as being apolitical, not as someone who does not possess any political opinions, but who behaves in a non-political fashion. And he wrote that there is a gap between private beliefs and the officer's expressed beliefs. He may have his beliefs and his opinions. He may not like the existing president, prime minister, commander-in-chief, but certainly must remain loyal to that individual. Huntington spoke about objective civilian control, meaning the absolute professionalization of the officer corps and the separation of the officer corps from the political sphere. Whereas Janowitz saw a little bit more of a messy and perhaps realistic world of interconnectedness, especially as an officer reaches the rank of lieutenant colonel, general officers. Well, they might begin butting up against the political system and political leaders, and they may be called upon to provide their professional opinions, but to do so in a professional and nonpartisan fashion. So you'll see the last bullet point for Janowitz is what it is, and for Huntington is what it ought to be. Huntington, as a political scientist, was looking at the political system as it ought to be. How should it be fashioned, and how should it function? Whereas Janowitz, as a sociologist, looked at society as it is, and so two very different approaches. Now, the concept of military intervention. What are some constants relative to military intervention across different societies and across different time periods? So first of all, in a society that has experienced military intervention, there are no universally accepted beliefs about the legitimacy of power. What is power? What is political power? What is military power? What is the dividing line between the two, and how is that power exercised? Those haven't been developed yet. Secondly, the military itself has not yet fully developed its professional dimensions and attitudes toward politics. You see this in new democracies, and you see this in countries that have experimented with democracy, but democracy keeps failing over and over again. Thirdly, some sort of political crisis, whether it is a sudden one or whether the crisis has developed over months or indeed over years. Fourthly, military intervention takes place when there is a perceived failure in governmental performance regarding the management of internal disorder. I mentioned earlier the notion of conservative realism as presented by the British writer Thomas Hobbes and the American sociologist C. Wright Mills. how military officers do not like disorder. They don't like disorder, certainly in their own profession, but they also don't like it in society. And they will very often equate that with the government's inability to manage society. The military thus becomes politicized and empowered. Military officers will begin taking sides. Military officers will begin openly espousing the platforms of particular political parties, and certainly they are empowered to be able to take action. They have arms. They have weapons. It's rather self-evident. And then finally, military intervention takes place where the prestige of the military and the state are linked, where you don't have this notion of separation of politics and the and the officer corps as presented by the Harvard professor Samuel Huntington, but where officers see that the prestige of their own prestige is linked to the prestige of the state, and if the prestige of the state is tarnished, well, then their own prestige is tarnished, or at least that's their perception. Now, let's apply some of these propositions relative to interwar Lithuania between World War I and World War II. Well, first of all, despite the fact that Lithuania, after World War I and after its wars of independence, established itself as a democratic republic, the standards of Western liberal democracy did not yet apply. You can create the structures of democracy, but if the philosophy of democracy is not present in the nation, if that mindset is not there, then those structures will either fail or they will function in less than democratic means. And that wasn't just the case with Lithuania. In general, in the 1920s and the 1930s, East Central European nations were still developing institutions, their own institutions and relationships among them. The benefit, let's say, that Western Europe possesses is that since Magna Carta was signed by the British king and the nobles in 1215, you've had several hundred years of the development of democratic philosophy within the sphere of political and social philosophy. That did not translate to East Central European nations at the time. Thirdly, the military in Lithuania did not comprehend what its role should be vis-a-vis politics. I had stated in the previous slide how these institutions are created, but their dimensions, what is considered appropriate behavior, what are the boundaries between institutions, those have not yet been developed. And that was certainly the case in Lithuania in the 1920s. Fourthly, civil-military relations in Lithuania cannot be understood strictly from a domestic perspective. There were legitimate external threats. And so when some Lithuanian scholars and non-Lithuanian scholars criticize Lithuania for being a less than democratic state between the two world wars, they also forget that there were legitimate external threats to Lithuania during that time period. And so Lithuania did need to remain vigilant. The Lithuanian armed forces did need to have a central role in society because it truly was a matter of survival. What happened was, though, this preeminent role of the military was diluted by its engagement in the political sphere, or I should say, all too often, political leaders and political actors forcing politics upon otherwise very professional military officers who wanted to do a good job as officers on behalf of the state. And then finally, especially in the year 1926, you had a juxtaposition of the military mind of conservative realism and domestic order and the volatile political situation that had developed in Lithuania during that year. So Lithuania in 1926, after 6 years of rule by the Christian Democratic Party under President Aleksandras Stulginskis, you had very contentious elections to the Seimas in May. The Christian Democrats lost their majority, and but nobody had a majority. No political party had a majority of the seats in Seimas, and so a coalition was formed between the Social Democrats and the peasant populace. That coalition began instituting democratic reforms. Very shortly thereafter, the country, especially in the provisional capital of Kaunas, experienced violent clashes and assaults. You had radical elements, especially members of the Communist Party, who took advantage of these new civil liberties. So, as I mentioned a moment ago, you can create democratic institutions, but unless they are backed up by democratic philosophy, experience in democracy, and a democratic mindset, those institutions are either going to crumble or they're just going to present a false face and not truly be democratic institutions. And so the Social Democrats and the peasant populace felt that the country was ready for democratic reform. And that was perhaps the case, but democratic reform happened a little bit too quickly for a country that wasn't used to democracy. Had it occurred a little bit more slowly, had political and social controls been loosened gradually, then maybe we wouldn't have seen the situation that developed in 1926. Military officers were watching what was happening in the country, and they began to equate not just the state's mismanagement with disorder and social generation, but they began to equate democracy itself and democratic institutions themselves with disorder and social degeneration. In other words, an officer said, okay, we're experimenting with democracy here and it's not working out. So maybe democracy is not such a very good system after all. And this became very fertile ground for the politicization of the military, especially when military officers themselves came under attack in the streets of Kaunas. Assaults actually took place against officers and non-commissioned officers. That was completely unacceptable, understandably, to the officer corps and to military leaders. All of this took place during the very brief 7-month administration of President Kazys Grinius. As time has gone on, people criticize Grinius and sometimes even say that he was not a patriotic Lithuanian. Actually, Kazys Grinius, who was a physician by profession, was quite the political patriot, the Lithuanian patriot. He was a member of the Lithuanian Democratic Party, which in 1905 was the first political party in Lithuania, Tsarist occupied Lithuania, that called for Lithuanian independence, not for autonomy within some sort of a Russian system, but for complete independence for the Lithuanian state. He was no friend of communism. He was no friend of the Bolsheviks. Bolsheviks murdered his first wife. So Kazys Grinius was certainly a Lithuanian patriot, as was his prime minister, Mykolas Sleževičius. Mykolas Sleževičius, several years before, had been the first prime minister who was credited with the creation of independent Lithuania's armed forces when he called for volunteers to defend the country against invaders after the declaration of independence. And so these were two patriotic people, but perhaps a little bit misguided. They thought that Lithuania was ready for democracy, but that was not the case. These radical elements, and I had mentioned the communists, certainly benefited almost exclusively by the removal of restraints on assembly, the gatherings of people. They benefited almost exclusively from the loosening of restraints on the press. plus also the amnesty that was given to prisoners who had violated these restraints. So during the administration of President Stulginskis, when censorship still took place, when there was greater control over society, those that had violated these norms of assembly and expression in the media were imprisoned. The Grinius and Šleževičius administration released those prisoners. The army, the police, and the Catholic Church became targets, and as I mentioned, there were actual physical assaults. Police officers first felt that they were not given the power to be able to act against disorder. Then the police, certainly that functioned under the Ministry of the Interior, and so hence under this political administration, were forced into subduing those who protested against what the communists and other radicals were doing in the country. You saw officers and civil servants who were deemed political enemies, perhaps loyal to the Christian Democratic Party, being discharged from military service and also from their service within the government. There was also a perception that demonstrators were not equally punished, that communists and those on the left were essentially allowed to do what they wanted to do. Those who opposed them were punished more severely. And that was seen during the student demonstrations of November 21st of that year, 1926, when rightist students who opposed communism demonstrated in Kaunas, but then the police with their batons very violently disrupted and dispersed that what had been a peaceful demonstration up until that time. And so that left a bad taste in the mouths of those who opposed what the Grinius administration was doing. And so that led to the coup d'etat of December 17, 1926. So the situation was the 60th birthday celebration of President Kazys Grinius. And so the various military commanders from around the country had gathered in the provisional capital of Kaunas for the official birthday celebrations. So these various commanders were in Kaunas. They were in a central location, and they were away from their military units. And so those who plotted the coup had a much easier time to carry out that coup. That night, the president, other officials were arrested by officers who were involved in the plot. Those commanders who were loyal to the I won't say loyal to President Grinius, but who were loyal to the Constitution, who may have ordered their units to advance to Kaunas to try to fight the coup, were unable to do so because the plotters of the coup had cut off communications from Kaunas to the various provinces and other areas. So these commanders who were in Kaunas were not able to communicate with their military officers. So they were powerless, and those in the provinces didn't know what was going on in Kaunas. So yes, a lieutenant walked into the president's bedroom in the presidential residence in Kaunas and arrested the president of the republic. They established a temporary military government, and they asked the first president of Lithuania, Antanas Smetona, to assume the presidency. President Smetona headed the Nationalist Association. Note that it wasn't referred to as the Nationalist Party. The way Smetona and the leaders of the Nationalists presented their party, their political faction, was that the Nationalists united the entire nation. It was not a political party or a faction that just represented a portion of the Lithuanian nation, but it was the Nationalist Association, and everybody who was a Lithuanian belonged by birth, naturally, to the Nationalist Association. But it wasn't just the Nationalists who had a vested interest in the coup. The Christian Democrats, who had been in power for 6 years, also had not liked what they were seeing in the country after the elections to the Seimas in May of 1926. And so they were also somewhat involved in the coup. Indeed, there was a gathering of political and military leaders, opponents of the Grynius regime, in military headquarters that night. One of the participants was former President Aleksandras Stulginskis. And so he had an interest in seeing order return to the country as well, not just military leaders. So Smetona is now asked to assume the presidency. Immediately, there are fears of a counter coup that may be carried out by the enlisted ranks. Those who carried out the coup began hearing of grumbling among the enlisted men that they didn't like what the officers had done. And indeed, the officers now became somewhat fearful of their own troops. They were instructed to sleep with their troops in the same barracks, not in separate quarters, to be able to keep an eye on them. Even the person who was known as the temporary dictator during the coup, Major Povilas Plechavičius, offered to stage a counter coup because he began to feel some regret for what he did in the hours and the days after the coup. Though later on, as his life continued in Lithuania and then later on in exile in the United States, he reconciled with the notion of the coup and having had a place in it. So President Grynius saw that he really had no choice, but he still wanted to maintain some semblance of an orderly transition. So while Grynius was under house arrest, he then appointed Augustinas Voldemaras as the prime minister. So President Grynius appoints Voldemaras as prime minister, and then President Grynius resigns the presidency. 2 days after the coup, on December 19th, there's a rump session of the Seimas. Not all of the members of the Seimas participated. Indeed, some of the members of the Seimas were in hiding at the time. They were fearful of arrest. And at that session, President Antanas Smetona was elected the new president of Lithuania. And so you now had President Smetona and you had Prime Minister Augustinas Voldemaras, who was also certainly a member of the Nationalist Association. President Smetona and his nationalists reached a compromise with the Christian Democrats, that the Christian Democrats would also have a say in how the government was run. However, that did not last long, because then President Smetona, on April 12th of 1927, dissolved the Seimas, ostensibly for the purpose of holding elections. But actually, those elections did not take place in 1927. Indeed, those elections only took place 10 years later in 1937. So for 1 decade, the president and his cabinet were the rulers of the country. Ironically, here is a photograph of President Grynius sometime in 1926, meeting with members of the Lithuanian Riflemen's Union, not integrated into the Lithuanian military, but still people in uniform and under arms. The Lithuanian Riflemen's Union, which obviously also functions in Lithuania today, was and is integrated into the national security structure and planning of the republic. So yes, Grynius was a patriotic Lithuanian. Indeed, Grynius's son, Kazys Jr., was a military officer. He was not punished. He reached the rank of colonel and held several senior level positions within the army and the Ministry of Defense. So it was a patriotic family. Some scenes from the coup. You see what they call tanks, what we might call armored personnel, or some sort of armored vehicles that are in front of the Seimas, in front of the military headquarters, and over on the left is a declaration in Lithuanian to society. And there you see in capital letters that the temporary military government, like Laikinoji Karo Valdžia, has declared a state of war in the entire country, and they have declared a state of siege within the city of Kaunas. There's another scene. We'll see some pictures actually from my book on civil military relations. You see some soldiers and military vehicles in front of military headquarters in Kaunas the morning after the coup. Also, the mythology of the coup that developed was that the coup took place without a shot being fired. That isn't the case. Um, uh, uh, at that time, Major Shkirpa, who was the commandant of the military academy, he actually rousted the cadets and armed them, and there were some skirmishes between the cadets and the officers and soldiers who were involved in the coup. Fortunately, no fatalities. I also believe there were no injuries during those brief skirmishes. I mentioned the individual who was asked to be the temporary dictator, and his temporary dictatorship lasted a couple of days. This was at the time Major Povilas Plechavičius. He had a major role early on in the Republic after the Declaration of Independence and during the Wars of Independence. He also had a role in, let's say, law enforcement. At the time you're looking at 1920, out in the provinces, you did not have a proper police force. You didn't have proper law enforcement and proper order. And so you had individuals known by various names, including bandits, who were terrorizing villages, small towns, terrorizing farmers. And so Plechavičius led the army into those areas in 1919 and 1920 to restore order. And very simply, they would capture, the locals. The local residents would identify these bandits. These bandits would be captured. There'd be a field court martial that was very, very fast, and then those bandits would be executed. Some people thought that his measures were harsh. However, looking at the context of innocent civilians being murdered, perhaps it was the actions that he took were necessary. But anyway, he served with distinction in the Lithuanian army. He was the temporary dictator, and then afterwards he continued on with his military service. Later on, he fled in 1944, fled the country, and ended up in Chicago, Illinois, where he passed away. So the consequences of the coup. Officers were split along party lines. You did not have an apolitical military, nor did you have a non-political military. You had now a politicized military, especially in 1927, 1928, 1929, a very heavily politicized officer corps. Also, you had a continued rift between officers and enlisted men, which impacted military discipline and training. Indeed, in the 13-year period from 1927 until June of 1940, there were 14 revolts against the Smetona administration. A couple of these revolts were larger in scale, others were smaller in scale and not really worth noting. But still, these were officers who tried to actively oppose the president, either to get the president to change his political course or to oust the president. Now, I noted that President Grinius, before resigning, appointed Augustinas Voldemaras as the prime minister. He was prime minister from December of 1926 until 1929, and there's a photograph of him there. Augustinas Voldemaras was an interesting character, a little bit smaller in stature. He was a brilliant scholar. He had earned a doctorate, and his dissertation had earned a gold medal. And he was a very fiery, hot-tempered person and a very arrogant person. He was an historian, and he felt that he was intellectually superior to pretty much everybody else, including the president. So he was at first an ally of President Smetona, but then even for President Smetona, he became too radical. And Voldemaras himself began challenging the Smetona administration. Iron Wolf, Geležinis Vilkas in Lithuanian, became a private paramilitary force for Augustinas Voldemaras, especially, well, made up of various people, including civil servants, farmers, students, people from various walks of life. But this secret Iron Wolf paramilitary organization that was loyal to Voldemaras and also not so secret had a relatively large contingent of Air Force officers. And it was the Air Force during the Voldemaras prime ministership, as well as on into the 1930s, they were the Air Force officers who tended to come out in greater opposition to the president versus Army officers. There are some of the Air Force officers in question. The gentleman second from the left, Antanas Machoika, at that time a Captain Machoika. He was a rather also hot-headed, hot-tempered individual who, with time, sought the downfall of President Smetona. He actually headed the officers group that carried out the coup, but then later on, he himself would come out in opposition to the president. What's interesting is I certainly didn't know Captain Machoika, but I knew his son, Benedictas Machoika, two very different people, whereas Antanas was a very hot-tempered military officer. Benedictas, his son, was an historian, was a professor, and a very quiet and mild-mannered professor. Among those 14 revolts that took place between 1927 and 1940, probably the largest one, the greatest threat to the Smetona administration was the failed Kubiliūnas revolt of June 1934 that was masterminded by Augustinas Voldemaras, who was by then out of power. He had been forced out of power by Smetona and his allies. Also by the Iron Wolf, the Geležinis Vilkas organization, and a number of Air Force officers. Even though it's referred to as the Kubiliūnas revolt, or in Lithuanian Kubiliūno sukilimas, the chief of staff, General Petras Kubiliūnas, was really not the mastermind. He was the tool of these plotters, but because he was the chief of staff, he was in a key position to help them carry out what they thought would be a coup against Smetona. Kubiliūnas really did not have an understanding of politics or economics. He was a military officer, a good military officer, but beyond that, he really didn't seem to know that much. He sought to replace not so much Smetona, but he sought to replace the prime minister, Juozas Tubelis, and the defense minister, Balys Giedraitis. And he thought that by replacing Tubelis with Augustinas Voldemaras, that Voldemaras would improve relations with Germany, that Germany in turn would purchase Lithuanian agricultural products. In turn, the Lithuanian economy would improve, and that would have a positive impact on military spending. So Voldemaras, Iron Wolf, these Air Force officers, really kind of hoodwinked Kubilunas into being their tool or their instrument. However, there were already news of this revolt had already reached Smetona. I mean, the Internal Security Department maintained surveillance. They kept their eyes and ears open, and so they got wind of what would be known as the Kubilunas revolt. So, as Kubilunas on the night from the 6th to the 7th of June, 1934, led a portion of the Kaunas garrison to the presidential residence, including some of those armored vehicles. He already found 175 soldiers loyal to President Smetona surrounding the presidential residence. Word is that President Smetona came out of the residence in his robe and told Kubilunas to return to the barracks and to return all of his soldiers to the barracks. And Kubilunas, evidently being the loyal officer that he was, said, "Yes, sir," and told his men and told his vehicles to go back to the garrison. But of course, those soldiers guarding the president certainly had an impact here. Finally, Augustinas Valdemaras was flown to Kaunas from internal exile. He was flown there by a Lithuanian Air Force aircraft from his internal exile in Zarasai. But the revolt failed, and he was arrested, and he was imprisoned. This brings up a phenomenon that repeats itself throughout the Smetona administration. People will refer to Smetona as a dictator, but certainly he was not a bloody dictator. And so, typically, let's say there was a revolt against the president. That individual would be tried by a court-martial and would be found guilty and typically sentenced to death. However, then the president would commute the sentence to life. Then, after a period of time, the sentence would be commuted to perhaps a few years in prison. And then finally, the sentence would be commuted again to internal exile. Internal exile meant you were sent off to a village somewhere in the province, as far away from Kaunas, where it was felt you couldn't cause any trouble for the administration. So it was the same thing with Valdemaras. He was never sentenced to death, but after he was removed to office, he was basically sent off to Zarasai, what was considered internal exile. Went back and forth a couple of times until he was finally just exiled from the country and deported from the country later on. There you see in the lower right, there's General Petras Kubilunas. Over in the upper left, there's Kubilunas on horseback during a military ceremony. You see President Smetona speaking before that large microphone. I thought that was an interesting picture. Very often when politicized military officers are discussed, or when military intervention is discussed, a reference is made to, quote, the man on horseback. And I thought it was very interesting. Here's a photograph of General Kubilunas on horseback, literally the man on horseback who would one day challenge the president. So as we enter the 1930s, the 10 years from 1930 to the Soviet occupation, which began in June of 1940, we see politics and the military becoming increasingly intertwined. Unfortunately, there was a great deal of instability among senior military leadership. Every new cabinet brought about changes in what was referred to as the big three of the defense minister, the commander-in-chief, and the chief of staff. Now, you would think that the commander-in-chief and the chief of staff would have some sort of an appointment with a term, and that there would be stability in those appointments. You could certainly see the defense minister changing with each cabinet, but that wasn't the case. Very often, all three of them would change with a new cabinet. So you had this instability. And again, you did not yet have a developed notion of what are the dimensions of these different institutions, political and military institutions, what are the boundaries between them, what is appropriate behavior. And so the uniformed commander-in-chief and uniformed chief of staff, full-time military officers, were almost seen as an element of the cabinet or of the government. The nationalists who were in power sought to nationalize the military. They wanted to promote and to appoint officers who were loyal to them. Many reserve officers who were loyal to the nationalists served in the Interior Ministry, which handled surveillance and handled law enforcement. A state of war, karo stovis, continued to exist. Now, I need to note the state of war wasn't a political tool. The state of war had existed in the country pretty much from the beginning, from the wars of independence, and was now specifically in place because of the continued occupation by Poland of the capital of Vilnius and the Vilnius territory. So there was a state of war between the two nations. A line of demarcation existed between the Polish occupied Vilnius territory and Lithuanian-controlled territory. The Polish army patrolled their side of the demarcation line. Lithuanian border police patrolled its side of the demarcation line. So the state of war existed, but it wasn't just a political tool. There was a legitimate reason for that state of war. You also had district military commandants, which would have been fine. They would have administered their units, commanded their units, but the district military commandants were also given a police function, a domestic police function, working with the internal security department. And you also had military tribunals trying violations of freedom of speech, of expression in the media that typically would have been tried by civilian courts. And so now you had these district military commandants, these military officers who were involved in civil law enforcement and in the civil judiciary. So on the one hand, you had these military officers who were carrying out the wishes of the president and the Nationalist Association. On the other hand, distrust began developing. And so the Internal Security Department, which worked with these officers, also was essentially spying on military officers to make sure that they remained loyal to the Nationalist Association and to the president. Also, books and publications during that time would be stamped or printed with karo cenzuros leista, or permitted by the military censor. So military censorship took place, and the censorship wasn't carried out by civilian civil servants. It was carried out by the military administration. And there's an example on the back cover of a book in the lower right, karo cenzuros leista, permitted by military censorship. Also, what was the relationship between the military and society? Well, there, as in many other countries, there was conscription. That was not a surprise. Young men were drafted into military service. They were trained and expected to serve for a certain period of time, especially for a country that was almost completely surrounded by enemies. That was something that was acceptable and something that would have been expected. What was very important was that the military also provided a means of education, both for officers and for enlisted soldiers. Later, in a few minutes here, I'll be discussing General Stasys Raštikis. Even though he was an officer, he had not completed, let's say, middle school, or as was known then, gymnasium. And so he had the opportunity to do so as a military officer. For enlisted soldiers coming in from the provinces, quite often they were illiterate. They did not know completely how to read and write. They didn't necessarily know about Lithuanian history, literature, Lithuanian culture. And so the military provided not just military training for these soldiers, but also a more generalized education for these soldiers as well. And that was something that was truly beneficial for the country to make it a more developed, more culturally aware, and better educated country. Visits by school groups and youth groups were arranged to visit military installations and get to know the soldiers and get to know their equipment. The military also participated in civil ceremonies and civil assistance when the Antanas River in Kaunas flooded in the 1930s. Lithuanian army soldiers assisted local law enforcement and local officials in helping the residents. There were also Army Society festivals where military vehicles, military equipment, artillery was brought out into a public area, and people were able to visit, talk with the officers, talk with the soldiers, be able to hold a rifle, be able to hold a machine gun, things of that nature. And as I mentioned earlier, the Lithuanian Riflemen's Union, Lietuvos Šaulių Sąjunga, was very instrumental. They were citizen soldiers, and so that was a means of having a greater connection between society and the nation's military forces. A couple of photographs from the Army and Society festivals. You see children being allowed to look into gun sights, and as I mentioned, they were allowed to not just hold weapons but also fire weapons as well. Also, here you have an instance of soldiers preparing to place birds' nests in a Lithuanian forest, and so that's where civil action comes into play. These soldiers were drawn from Lithuanian society, and so the military wanted to show that Lithuanian soldiers not just defended society from external threats, but also assisted society internally. I mentioned General Stasys Raštikis, who became what his biographer called the persona prima, the first person in military affairs in Lithuania from 1934, but especially from 1935 until 1940. Aleksandras Merkelis, who was his biographer, who wrote a very substantial volume on President Smetona, dubbed General Raštikis as persona prima. General Raštikis had a very distinguished career. He volunteered for military service in 1919 during the Wars of Independence. During one firefight, he was wounded. He was wounded and bleeding in the middle of the battlefield while the Bolsheviks and Lithuanian forces exchanged gunfire over him and over other wounded troops who were on the battlefield. He was captured and held in various Russian hospitals and prisons until 1921, when a prisoner exchange took place. He remained with the Lithuanian army, had distinguished service in various posts. He was appointed the chief of staff of the army in 1934, following the Kubiliūnas revolt and the dismissal of Kubiliūnas from the Lithuanian army. And then in 1935, he was appointed commander-in-chief, the chief uniformed officer in the country. Now, there was also a family connection. He was married to President Smetona's niece. However, despite that, Raštikis himself said that his relationship with the president was not familial, but was a professional relationship. He obviously respected the president and the presidential office, and so Raštikis, as a professional, did not use that family relationship for any kind of advantage. However, despite that, as the years went on, he felt that some of the advice that Raštikis would give, either privately or sometimes in public, in articles that he had written for publication, were challenges to the president. And Smetona suspected Raštikis of forming a rival power center. Not going into details, but because of that, Raštikis was discharged from his duties in January of 1940. Raštikis wrote a 4-volume set of his memoirs, which is truly a monument in Lithuanian historiography. You could have a series of lectures on Raštikis. You could have a series of lectures on the coup. Obviously, here we're not going into those details. There's a picture of the general in his dress uniform with his decorations. Immediately upon becoming commander-in-chief, he presented a plan for military reform. First of all, he called for a military alliance with Latvia and Estonia. The situation with Russia had quieted down, but there was still a state of war with Poland, and he felt that a military alliance with Latvia and Estonia would be helpful for a national defense. He also tried to clarify the roles of those big three: the defense minister, the commander-in-chief, and the chief of staff, so that there would be greater stability and so that each individual would know what his role was. He called for the creation of, and indeed it was created, a state defense board, which would be chaired by the president to be able to examine defense issues from a broader perspective, including different individuals and cabinet officers, and not just military people. The defense minister would chair a military board, which also would try to have a more holistic view of defense, bringing in various civilian and military advisors. And then he also certainly called for a substantial increase in defense spending. Now, just as most military officers with that mindset of conservative realism, Raštikis also had a disdain for some of the political excesses that were taking place in the country at the time, and in what he felt were unethical political disputes. He also disliked the state of war, not necessarily for external reasons, but he didn't like the state of war being applied internally to society, domestically. He didn't like the fact that the military was carrying out a censorship role. He felt that that was not that was not something that military officers should be doing. He also no longer allowed the army to carry out civilian death sentences that had been handed down to criminals in civilian courts. He said if those death sentences are carried out, they are to be carried out by the civil authorities, not by the military authorities. There was an uprising among farmers in Suwalka in 1934. While Raštikis was on vacation in Palanga, the defense minister ordered the army into the areas where the farmers were carrying out their uprising, and ordered the army to disperse those farmers and to restore order. Raštikis heard about this. He felt that the army should not be involved in that if in fact the army would begin dispersing and inflicting violence upon the farmers, that would harm the military relationships between society and the armed forces, and that also these soldiers that had come very often from rural backgrounds might even revolt and not carry out their orders. So he countermanded those orders by telephone. He was able to reach the commander who was leading the forces and said, "No, you're not going to do that." Obviously, the defense minister didn't care for that, but Raštikis felt that was a decision that had to be made. Raštikis also stated that officers who had been transferred to political duties must return either to regular service, must withdraw from those duties, or to retire from the active army and go to the reserve. There had been arguments made that the commander-in-chief should be a member of the prime minister's cabinet, and he argued against that. He didn't want the commander-in-chief's office to become politicized. However, Raštikis did, as I mentioned, increasingly make what could be construed as political statements, perhaps even challenges to political policy, which did not endear him to Smetona and to the nationalists. Now we finally come to the twilight of independence in 1940. In general, politics weakened the military establishment. Despite the efforts by General Stasys Raštikis to make the Lithuanian army more professional, and in many ways he certainly succeeded. The late 1930s truly saw a renaissance for the Lithuanian armed forces and a professionalization of the armed forces that was also noted by foreign military attachés who were assigned to Kaunas. But political activity and political intervention into the officer corps had weakened the military establishment. Huntington's subjective civilian control, which saw a very solid wall between politics and the military, was eclipsed by objective civilian control, which sees that wall between politics and the military, was overshadowed by what he called subjective civilian control and the military's functional imperative. In other words, politics began to be injected into the military sphere. Also in June of 1940, even the president was surprised when his senior military leadership in the final cabinet meeting of June 15th, 1940, in the face of a Soviet ultimatum, when the senior military leadership stated, no, we're not in a position to fight, rendering Lithuania essentially defenseless. Though many in the ranks were willing to fight, the senior leadership was not. And indeed, General Raštikis, who had actually been invited to that final cabinet meeting as a civilian, he was now in the reserve, and other senior officers advised that Lithuania accept all three ultimatums: the Polish ultimatum of 1938, the German ultimatum of 1939, which demanded that the Klaipėda region be turned over to Germany, and certainly the Soviet ultimatum of 1940, demanding that an unlimited number of Red Army soldiers be admitted into the country. And so the army had been rendered passive by the nationalist regime, surprising even the president himself. There you see several of the 150,000 Red Army soldiers who entered the country on June 16th of 1940. There you see a border post with the Lithuanian Vitas, our national symbol, as the Red Army walks past it. And so we saw the ghost of 1926, the coup of 1926, once again in 1940. I would say that the coup was necessary. That's my final assessment. I'm a supporter of constitutions and of democracy, but where democracy has not yet taken hold, and where disorder has spread to the point where the nation's survival itself is in danger, as it was in Lithuania in December of 1926, I think the coup was necessary. So the military during that coup both saved the nation, however, also set the stage for political gamesmanship within the military and directed toward the officer corps. Certainly, the ties with society strengthened the armed forces, but politics, the gendarme role, the military tribunals, military censorship, courts-martial being applied to civilians, weakened its martial spirit to the point where the nation was defenseless in 1938, 1939, and most obviously in 1940, when it required defense the most. And so thank you very much for my time. That concludes my presentation, and I just pressed the stop sharing button here. I'll close that out.
Thank you, Robertas, for such a interesting and detailed overview of that volatile historical period, and also you provided many details which I even didn't know, so thank you very much for your interesting and your sharing of your nice presentation. So maybe Valdas, maybe you have some questions. We can maybe have allocate 5 minutes for the discussion.
Of course, I have questions.
Okay.
I have everything.
Okay.
And I don't know, Robert, as I understood, you speak perfect Lithuanian. So shall we continue with this foreign language, or we should switch to our native language?
Well, I don't know. Vaidotai, is this still being recorded?
I would suggest, because we started, because I'm still recording here. So
Recording, because it will be very inconvenient questions.
okay, so
You know, if you'd like to ask the question in Lithuanian, what I can do is I can translate it into English, and then perhaps I
I
can.
speak, I also
No, but
speak English,
it's-
so we can also ask questions in English. So
okay, okay, let's do this. Thank you, and I will switch off recording, so we will be
Okay.
we will talk more openly. Okay,
More
thank you.
freely.
Yeah,
So,
just a moment.
Robertai, labai ačiū, tikrai
Ačiū.
nustebinai, tikrai labai įdomi prezentacija, bet aš